That's recording. Yeah, it's recording.
نبدأ؟
Yeah.
Okay. الاستيقاظ والكم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. إن الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونستهديه ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا إنه من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله أما بعد. Thank you everybody for coming to the first lesson of the Seerah of the Prophet ﷺ. So this is a new series of talks and lessons inshallah I tend to give. Now originally I was thinking twice a week if people are interested, Mondays and Thursdays, and I was thinking roughly 1 hour before Isha prayer, at least until, well, we have daylight savings, and then after daylight savings we'll see the time will have to change again. Or during Ramadan of course there will be a break, inshallah. So this series of lessons, won't just be narrating the story of the Prophet's life. So I intend to give a proper analysis and understand why certain decisions were made, why certain events happened, so we can get a better understanding and appreciation of what the Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So with that, and also so we can understand and appreciate the genius of the Prophet, and not just listen to a story from beginning to end. Did this, he went there, he said this, he said that. It's not enough. It's much more beneficial to understand why things happened, why he said the things he did, what decisions he made them. And as I said, we Muslims don't appreciate the genius of the Prophet, and they don't appreciate his life as they should. And this is why I'll be covering a number of reasons now as to why learning the Seerah is actually fundamental, very fundamental for every Muslim. Every Muslim needs to know the Seerah of the Prophet, the life of the Prophet. These are some of the reasons I'll cover, inshallah. So the first reason is actually listed number 2. Allah's command to know the Prophet. So waqsus al-qasas, it's actually in the Quran. Verse in the Quran is in it, but waqsus al-qasas. Yes. Learning the Seerah also increases the love of the Prophet. So when you know how much the Prophet suffered, what he did, you should live it, because we have abundant information about his life, probably more than probably any other human being, in minute details of his both private and public life. So, and this is very rare for any human being, and especially for somebody who lived over 1,400 years ago. We have so much detailed information about his life. And as Muslims, we need to know. Of course, we need to know about our Prophet. We hear a lot of things, a lot of criticism of the Prophet, a lot of criticism based on ignorance. People say that he was a warmonger. People say that he was a womanizer. People say that he married Sayyidah Aisha when she was an infant. All sorts of things which based on ignorance, based on and also a prejudice against Islam, which is why Muslims need to know his life in detail so they can respond to these people, to tell them that what the Prophet did was not only correct, it was the best thing that it had to happen. Another reason is to understanding the Seerah helps us to understand the Quran better. So this is when you study tafsir of the Quran, there is something called Asbab al-Nuzul. When you find a verse in the Quran, it was revealed for a particular situation, and so we need to understand why. So this is all in the Seerah of the Prophet. So if you were to say ignore the Seerah and just read the Quran only, and ignore the Hadith, ignore the Seerah, you'll get confused. So for example, there's one verse that says, it's a command from Allah, do not pray while you are in a state of drunkenness, do not pray while you're drunk. And then later, in another verse in the Quran, it says, avoid alcohol completely. You'll get confused. You don't know whether it's because the first verse doesn't specifically prohibit alcohol, whereas the second one does. This might be something that people will criticize the Quran for, but there is a reason why one verse said one thing and another verse said another thing. So we need to understand this as well. This is all in the Seerah. The Seerah raises our hopes, lifts our spirit, and blesses us with optimism. So we live in a very difficult time. We see Muslims suffering, a lot of wars, people dying, and we look at the Seerah and we see that the Muslims of the Prophet's time, even the Prophet himself, suffered immensely. And to see how they lived their lives and how they managed to overcome all their difficulties, and how their faith in Allah was so rock solid, so strong. This is a big inspiration for us Muslims to be able to continue on suffering and to be able to, inshallah, overcome our difficulties. Another thing is the Seerah itself is a miracle. So some of the things that happened during the life of the Prophet, you could only describe as a miracle. For example, the digging of the trench around the city of Medina. It's a story, yes, they dug a trench so that the enemy army couldn't cross into Medina. But you look at it in detail, you find it is nothing short of a miracle how they dug that trench in such a short period of time. It was very difficult, backbreaking work. Another reason is the Seerah lays out a precise methodology for the revival of the Ummah. So the Prophet was building a new Ummah, an Islamic nation, from scratch. Now look at our situation now. The Ummah exists, but it is fragmented, it is weak, it is not incapable, it's incapable of defending itself, incapable of doing anything really. We need to be able to rebuild this Ummah. And a good way is to study the Seerah of the Prophet, see how he dealt with certain situations, and to learn from what he did, and inshallah, for us to rebuild our Ummah so that we become powerful once again in the future, inshallah. Through the Seerah, we also see the life and times of the best generation, so the Prophet and the Sahaba, and what sort of people they were, and how they lived, and how the Sahaba, the men and women, they were real people with guts, people with intelligence, people who understood the religion. And we study the Seerah, we get inspired and learn about these people. Great people such as Umar ibn al-Khattab and Khalid ibn al-Walid, and how amazing they were. For example, Sayyidina Umar ibn al-Khattab, what a very courageous, very fearless man he was. When it was time for the hijrah from Mecca to Medina, the Prophet had ordered all the other Muslims to immigrate in secret. Sayyidina Umar sought permission from the Prophet to go out in public and say, I'm leaving Mecca now, and whoever wants to stop me has a wife wants to become a widow. He said he's ready to kill anybody who gets in his way. He's going to leave Mecca and he's ready to kill anybody who gets in his way. This is real courage. And the last reason which I've already covered is that defending the honor of the Prophet. There are a lot of lies, accusations. And it isn't just the Prophet Muhammad, the previous prophets also, people lied against them. People said all kinds of bad things. Sayyidina Musa was affected. Sayyidina Maryam alayhi salam was affected. People said all kinds of lies about them. The same thing with Sayyidina Muhammad. So we can defend him. This is very critical. Otherwise, if we are unable to defend the Prophet, and people come with accusations, that will cause doubt in our own hearts about our own religion. Thinking maybe that what this person is saying is correct. Maybe the Prophet was a warmonger. Maybe he was a womanizer. Maybe he really was. And it's not true at all. Anyway, so we'll cover, inshallah, the situation around the region, or in the Arabian Peninsula, and see what, in order to be able to contrast the world as it was just before and before the Prophet was born, and before the message, he became a messenger. how the world looked like, and compare that with how the world looked like after the Prophet, Islam appeared. And I wanted to start off, this is a very long hadith, and I only put a small portion of it here. The Prophet says, that speaking about Allah, he says, إِنَّ اللَّهَ نَظَرَ إِلَى أَهْلِ الْأَرْضِ فَانْقَطَعَهُمْ وَعَرَبَهُمْ وَعَجَمَهُمْ إِلَّا بَقَايَ من أهل الكتاب. So the situation was so bad. People were living in such ignorance, despite the fact that there were Ahl al-Kitab, there were Jews and Christians, people who already received revelation. And yet, the world was a very bad place, a very dark place. People were suffering, there was slavery, there was all sorts, there were killings, there was all sorts of really bad, it was a very bad place to live. And Allah looked at the world and He disliked what He saw, according to the hadith. And I'll come back to this hadith again, inshallah. It was when I narrated another story of one of the Sahaba. Now, Byzantine, the Roman Byzantine Empire, the Roman Empire, which was a Christian empire. The situation there was that marriage had become, people getting married later in life, at an older age. Some people had even stopped getting married because of the high cost, something similar to what's happening in some Muslim countries today. The children were born out of wedlock. Bribery was rampant, heavy taxes, brutality. So some of us who've read history will know about the slavery in the Roman Empire. The Romans loved slaves, and apparently the number of slaves in the Roman Empire outnumbered free people 3 to 1. In the original the Roman Empire, which had spanned from Iraq all the way to England, during the early period, after the Sayyidina Isa's life, there was a Christian community. These Christians were severely persecuted by the pagan Romans who worshipped the gods, their pagan gods. And so that the Christians were thrown into the big Colosseum and thrown with wild animals like lions to kill them. During the reign of Emperor Vespasian, also there was so the Jews also suffered, not just the Christians. The Jews refused, they had to recognize the Roman Emperor as a god. And the Jews refused to recognize him as a god. They were also being monotheists, they believed worship only one god. That led to a number of wars, Roman Jewish wars, in which the Jews were slaughtered and expelled from Palestine. And this is just a map of the original Roman Empire that I was talking about. So slavery was rampant, bribery, and even the early Christian, yes, I know that in Egypt, there's the Coptic Christians in Egypt. They have their own Coptic calendar, Christian calendar. And this calendar, I don't remember what year it starts off with, but it starts off with an era they call the era of the martyrs, Ahl al-Shuhada. And during that period, the beginning of that Christian Coptic calendar, according to the Coptics, hundreds of thousands of Coptic Christians were slaughtered by the Romans, just in Egypt alone, 700,000 to 800,000 in a number of years. Have you heard of this? Ahl al-Shuhada.
I think first time.
First time? Okay.
Inshallah.
But it wasn't just in Egypt, as I said, there were Christians being persecuted even in Italy, in Rome. They were thrown into the Colosseum with wild animals. This is the later Roman Empire, which we call the Byzantine Empire. By this period, the Roman Empire had become Christian. But even then, yes, Christianity had become strong, had become the dominant religion, but even then, there was division amongst the Christians themselves as to the nature of Jesus. So some Christians believed that Jesus was one person with two natures. Other Christians believed that Jesus was one person with one nature. It seems trivial to us, but it actually led to violence between Christians, killing each other. The Persian Empire. Persian Empire, they had all kinds of weird practices. So forbidden marriages between, say, within the family, a man between daughter, sister, and mother. The emperor had the right to marry whoever he wanted. This is actually unique to the Persian Empire. In Egypt, this was also practiced by the pharaohs. In the Persian Empire, they had something called Mazdaism. So as a religion, it was an offshoot of another religion called Zoroastrianism. And this was something similar to communism, modern day communism, where people didn't have personal property. So the property was owned by the community. Anybody could take whatever they wanted. And that, of course, led to a decline in productivity. The emperor in Persia was also considered a god. So this is typical of ancient civilizations. So this is the same in the Roman Empire. The Roman emperor was a god. In ancient Egypt, the pharaoh was a god. You expected to worship him. If you didn't, there was trouble for you. In the Persian Empire, there were classes. So you had the royal class, clergy, warrior, cultured, literate, educated, civil service administration, and the rest. So the population was stratified into certain classes. And this is something similar to what you find in India. You have the caste system. People you're born into a certain caste, and caste is like a class, different class of people. And you could only marry within your caste. You couldn't marry outside of the caste. And if that happened, there was problems. In Northern Europe, in Scandinavia, personal hygiene, they didn't even know what personal hygiene was. So we're talking about in Scandinavia, the Vikings. This was around the beginning of the Vikings, when the Prophet was born. And also in Christian Europe, they would bathe once or twice a year with cold water. They never washed their clothes. So the belief, especially amongst the Christian communities, was that you'd get baptized and then you didn't need to take a bath afterwards, because they didn't want to get rid of the baptism water, because it was supposed to be holy water. Illiteracy was rampant, ignorance was rampant. And there's a very famous, what's the word?
Traveler.
Sorry?
A
Traveler, yes. This is a couple of centuries after the Prophet's life. A man named Ibn Fadlan, who's from the Abbasid kingdom, Abbasid dynasty. He travelled to Scandinavia, and it was a very famous account that he wrote about the Vikings and how they lived. This was one particular narration. He talked about a tent that the Vikings were sleeping in, and he was there with them. He witnessed this with his own eyes. He saw, for example, a slave girl walking in. This is in the morning when everybody was waking up. There's the girl coming with a bowl of water. So she first goes to the chief of the Vikings. And so he hands it, she's holding the bowl. The chief of the Vikings starts washing his face to wake up. He rinses his mouth, blows out his nose, and all the water goes back into the bowl. And then she takes the bowl and goes to the next person. And the next person uses the same water to do the same thing. Wash his face, rinse his mouth, clean his nose. And then it all goes back into the same bowl with the same water. And then she goes to the next person. And then she goes around, everybody uses the same water. And she also, Ibn Fadlan also wrote an account of the funeral of a Viking when he died. So this was an important warrior. He had a slave girl and his slaves, and he had some treasures. Anyway, so he passed away. The people chose one of the slave girls to die with him, and so she was given, a period of time where she was pampered and treated very well, nicely, whatever. Then when it was finally time, she was strangled to death, and then they put the body of the man, the chieftain, the Viking, in a boat on the river, and they put the girl's body with him, and then they burnt them, the boat with the bodies on it. Egypt had been a breadbasket for the Roman Empire for more than 500 years. So maybe 800 years. It was a breadbasket, meaning that Egypt was a very fertile, because of the fertile land, the Romans took advantage of that, and they used the produce to feed much of the Roman Empire, so the Roman Empire. Because of the Roman rule, Egypt declined, the economy of Egypt declined, and education. So compare that to Egypt during the time of the pharaohs, where they're highly skilled and highly educated, compared to under the Romans. Romans imposed heavy taxes, and taxes on pretty much anything. Taxes on people, taxes on manufactured goods, land taxes, animal taxes, sales taxes, road taxes, taxes on married soldiers, furniture, even death taxes. So if somebody died, a tax had to be paid. And of course, and as I mentioned, there was religious persecution and massacres. So even the Christians in Egypt, even though Christians in Egypt had become Christian, they were following the wrong type of Christianity, and they were persecuted and killed, many of them, even by fellow Christians, the Byzantine Romans. In China, you had three different religions at the same time: Taoism, Confucianism, and Buddhism. Taoism, these sort of faiths were more theoretical and more less spiritual, and so they didn't really matter. They didn't care much about the spiritual side. You could do worship whatever you wanted, but there were certain rules that you had to live your life by. Some of the things they do agree with what's Islam. So Confucianism talks about being an honest person, being a good person, treating other people fairly. Same thing with Buddhism. You have to be humble. You have to be a stoic. You have to be. But in the end, these religions lacked some certain things, especially from the spiritual side. And we see that in later Chinese history, there were civil wars, and these civil wars were very, very brutal, in which millions of people would be slaughtered. And this is well before the 20th century. You had 3 or 4 different civil wars, very, very brutal ones. One war, there were like 20 million Chinese killed. In India, there were people you might have seen, the Hindus, and what they worship, or the statues, but it isn't just the statues. They worship pretty much anything. They can worship people. For example, there is a festival where the wife worships the husband. There's a festival where, the Hindus will worship even a tree. They will worship rivers. I actually saw this. Personally, I was in India and I saw there was a special holy tree. They put some pictures or decorated the tree because it's a special holy tree. And then I saw a stray dog come next to the tree and urinate next to the tree. They worship animals. The Hindus are well known for worshipping cows, but also rats. So back in, I think in the late 90s, there was a plague, rats had run rampant throughout the country, or certain areas, and the Hindus wouldn't kill them because the rats were sacred animals. But at the same time, these rats were carrying disease. So people called diseases, and there was a plague. There were other things that I've already discussed, but women were treated as a second class. They were sometimes used as collateral for gambling. Well, the husband would go gambling, the husband would lose, then he would offer his wife as payment in gambling. The Jews had a long history of treachery. Even during, we're told about this in the Quran, how they treated Prophet Musa, how they refused to obey him. But also Allah tells us that the Jews from time to time would kill their own prophets. But they were also strict monotheists, and they were punished repeatedly throughout history by the Romans. But also now, inshallah, as we'll find out, that they were betrayed the Prophet. They made certain treaties with the Muslims, and they broke that treaty. And I mentioned before about the Christians. The Christians were very confused about their own religion, about the nature of Jesus, and that led to violence, a lot of people getting killed. And I mentioned also persecution of Christians in Egypt and Rome. And there was severe persecution of Christians in an region called Najran. Najran is located in the south of Saudi Arabia on the border of Yemen. And that's partially narrated in the Quran as Ashab al-Ukhdud, the ruler of the region, slaughtered a large number of Christians by digging a huge trench, filling it with fire, and throwing people inside the fire. The first council of Nicaea. So, because the Christians were very confused and there was a lot of violence as there were disagreement between the Christians, the Roman Emperor held a council, sort of like a conference in the city of Nicaea in modern-day Turkey, in the year 325, to decide the nature of Jesus. This is how confused the Christians were. So it took about over 300 years of confusion and persecution until finally they had the Council of Nicaea and they decided Jesus was Son of God and it was one of 3 parts of God or something like that, something crazy. And yes, it's in Ethiopia had become Christian. I don't know what sort of Christianity they were following. I know that one day in Ethiopia they follow Coptic Christianity, similar to what's in Egypt. Also, in Surah Al-Fil, there's the famous surah. The ruler of Yemen was under Ethiopian rule, and this governor was very upset that the Arabs were going to Mecca. This is before Islam, before the Prophet was born. They were traveling to Mecca to make pilgrimage. So he decided to march with an army to Mecca to destroy the Kaaba, and the story that in the Quran tells us that Allah sent the fleet of birds and destroyed the army. Now apparently the remains, because he wanted to build a replacement to the Kaaba in Yemen, in Sana'a. There was a church called the Goddess, something like that. And apparently the remains of that church are still there. In the Americas, the only the main civilizations were the Mayans, Aztecs, and Incas. Should we stop there now?
I can't, it's at 10:10. So yeah, you can go for a bit more if you want.
A little bit more?
الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله حي على الصلاة حي على الصلاة حي على الفلاح حي على الفلاح الله أكبر الله أكبر لا إله إلا الله
Stop there, inshallah. Continue inshallah beginning at 9:15 inshallah Thursday. استذكروا معكم ولكم وشفوا الله من الله وما يصيب العباد